A Miss Marple mystery story in the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, where gossip flows as freely as tea at the vicarage. A seemingly innocent garden party turns deadly when a scone laced with poison claims a life. Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp mind and unassuming demeanor, must unravel a web of secrets, grudges, and hidden motives among the village's elite. Set in the charming yet deceptive 1930s English countryside, this tale weaves witty dialogue, intricate clues, and a shocking twist that will leave you questioning the hearts of even the most respectable villagers. Chapter 1. The Invitation to the vicarage. The late summer sun cast a golden glow over St. Mary Mead, painting the thatched cottages and rose gardens in hues of amber and rose. Miss Jane Marple sat in her modest drawing-room, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she pondered the letter that had arrived with the morning post. It was an invitation, penned in the neat, looping hand of Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, requesting her presence at a garden party at the vicarage on Saturday. A small affair, the letter promised, to celebrate the new rose garden and bring the village together. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. Small affairs in St. Mary Mead, she knew, were rarely as innocent as they seemed. The village thrived on its undercurrents, whispers of old rivalries, hushed scandals, and secrets buried beneath polite smiles. She folded the letter and set it beside her teacup, already curious about who might attend and what might simmer. Beneath the surface, the vicarage garden party was the talk of the village by midweek. At the post office, Mrs. Price, the postmistress, gossiped with Mrs. Weatherby about the guest list. "Mrs. Bantry's coming, of course," Mrs. Price said, adjusting her pants. "And that new couple, the Harrisons, from London. Quite grand, I hear." Mrs. Weatherby sniffed. "Grand or not, I don't trust that Mrs. Harrison. Too many jewels for a village party, if you ask me. And then there's Mr. Redding, the artist, always lurking about with that sketchbook. Up to no good, mark my words." Miss Marple, collecting her post, listened quietly from the corner. She never gossiped herself, but she found the village's chatter as revealing as a detective's notebook. Mr. Redding, she recalled, had once courted Miss Clara Vane, the vicar's niece, before her engagement to young Dr. Haydock fell apart under mysterious circumstances, and the Harrisons, newcomers with a glossy veneer, had already stirred whispers about their sudden wealth. Interesting, she thought, her needles pausing briefly. On Saturday, Miss Marple, dressed in her best black silk dress, a brooch of amethyst glinting at her collar, and set off for the vicarage. The air was warm, scented with lavender and freshly cut grass. As she approached, the vicarage lawn came into view, transformed into a scene of genteel festivity. White tablecloths fluttered in the breeze, silver teapots gleamed, and a long table groaned under plates of scones, cucumber sandwiches, and Victoria sponges. Mrs. Clement, flushed and bustling, greeted guests with her usual warmth. "Miss Mott, how delightful!" she exclaimed, clasping Jane's hands. "You must see the new roses. Reverend Clement is so proud of them. I shouldn't miss them for the world." Miss Marple replied, her voice soft but her gaze sharp as she scanned the crowd. There was Mrs. Bantry, resplendent in a floral hat, laughing with Colonel Bantry. The Harrisons stood slightly apart, Mrs. Harrison's diamond earrings catching the sunlight. Mr. Redding, the artist, leaned against a yew tree, sketching idly, his eyes darting toward Clara Vane, who hovered near the tea table, her face pale. Dr. Haydock, the village physician, was deep in conversation with Mr. Giles, the local solicitor, whose nervous fidgeting caught Miss Marple's attention as she accepted a cup of tea from a maid. Miss Marple noted the small details, the way Mrs. Harrison's smile tightened when Clara passed by, the quick glance Mr. Redding threw at Dr. Haydock, and the faint tremor in Mr. Giles's hand as he reached for a scone. The village, she thought, was like her knitting pull one thread, and the whole pattern might unravel. The afternoon wore on with polite chatter and the clink of china. Miss Marple sipped her tea, listening to Mrs. Bantry's tales of her travels, and Mrs. Clement's plans for the church fete, but beneath the pleasantries, she sensed an undercurrent, a ripple of unease she couldn't yet place. It was as if the garden itself held its breath, waiting for something to happen, and something, she felt certain, would. What did you think of the gathering at the vicarage? Where are you listening this mystery from your cozy living room, a bustling cafe, or perhaps a quiet village like St. Mary Mead? Share your location and thoughts below. and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for the next thrilling chapter of Miss Marple and the poisoned scone at the garden party. The secrets of St. Mary Mead are just beginning to unfold. Chapter 2. Gathering clouds over St. Mary Mead. The vicarage lawn buzzed with the hum of conversation, punctuated by the occasional trill of laughter or the clatter of teaspoons against saucers. Miss Jane Marple sat beneath a shady oak, her knitting resting in her lap as she observed the guests with the quiet intensity of a naturalist studying a rare species. The garden party was in full swing, but the air carried a faint edge, like the distant rumble of a storm not yet visible. Mrs. Clement flitted from group to group, her cheeks rosy from the effort of playing hostess. "More tea, Mrs. Bantry," she called, lifting a silver pot. Mrs. Bantry, her floral hat bobbing, waved a hand. "Oh no, dear, I'm quite content with this scone. Heavenly, as always." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the scones, piled high on a tiered stand, their golden surfaces studded with currants. Mrs. Clement's cook, Mary, was renowned for her baking, and the scones were a point of pride. Yet Miss Marple noted how Clara Vane, standing near the table, hesitated before taking one, her fingers hovering as if uncertain. Clara's face, framed by soft brown curls, was drawn, her eyes darting toward the Harrisons. Mr. and Mrs. Harrison stood near the rose garden, their city polish setting them apart from the tweed and corduroy villagers. Mrs. Harrison, in a sleek green dress, spoke animatedly to Colonel Bantry, her laughter a touch too loud. Her husband, a tall man with slicked back hair and a gold watch chain, scanned the crowd with a detached air. Miss Marple wondered what had brought them to St. Mary Mead. Newcomers often arrived with secrets she had found, and the Harrisons' polished exterior seemed a carefully constructed facade. Across the lawn, Mr. Redding, the artist, had abandoned his sketching to join a small group near the fountain. His bohemian scarf and tousled hair drew disapproving glances from Mrs. Weatherby, who whispered to Mrs. Price, "He's far too familiar with Clara, if you ask me." And after that business with Dr. Haydock, too, Miss Marple's ears pricked up. The business with Dr. Haydock was old village gossip, but gossip, she knew, often held kernels of truth. Clara Vane and Dr. Haydock had been engaged 2 years prior, only for the engagement to dissolve abruptly. Some said Clara had broken it off, others whispered of a rival. Mr. Redding's name had surfaced then, and Miss Marple noted the way he now hovered near Clara, his expression a mix of concern and something sharper possessiveness, perhaps. Dr. Haydock himself stood apart, his broad shoulders stiff as he spoke with Mr. Giles, the solicitor. Mr. Giles, a wiry man with a perpetually anxious demeanour, clutched a teacup as if it were a lifeline. "It's a delicate matter, Doctor," Miss Marple overheard him say, his voice low. "The estate papers. Complications, you understand." Dr. Haydock nodded curtly, but his eyes flicked toward Clara, and Miss Marple caught a flash of pain in them. The village clock chimed 3, its notes drifting over the garden. Miss Marple's gaze shifted to a young woman in a plain grey dress, Miss Emily Thorne, the vicar's cousin, who had arrived in St. Mary Mead only a month ago. Emily was quiet, almost invisible, her eyes fixed on the ground as she moved through the crowd, offering plates of sandwiches. Yet Miss Marple noticed how Emily's hands trembled slightly when she passed Mrs. Harrison, and how Mrs. Harrison's smile faltered in return. A history there, perhaps, Miss Marple thought, filing the observation away. As the afternoon wore on, the chatter grew louder, the sun hotter. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind cataloguing the small dissonances. Clara's unease, Mr. Giles's nervousness, the Harrisons' guarded glances, Mr. Redding's watchful eyes. The village was a tapestry of hidden threads, and she sensed one was about to snap. She was not wrong. As Mary, the cook, brought out a fresh tray of scones, a sudden shout broke the pleasant hum of the party. Heads turned, teacups paused mid-air, and Miss Marple's knitting needles stilled. Something was about to happen, and she felt the familiar prickle of anticipation that always accompanied the unravelling of a mystery. Chapter 3. Arrival at the party. The vicarage lawn was a picture of English summer charm, with its neatly trimmed hedges, vibrant rosebeds, and the gentle hum of bees drifting through the air. Miss Jane Marple, seated on a wicker chair near the edge of the gathering, adjusted her shawl and let her gaze wander over the arriving guests. Her unobtrusive position allowed her to observe without drawing attention, a habit honed over years of quietly studying the intricacies of human behaviour in St. Mary Mead. The garden party was now in full bloom, with villagers mingling under the striped awning that shaded the tea tables. Mrs. Clement, ever the gracious hostess, darted about, ensuring no guest lacked for refreshment. "Do try the cucumber sandwiches, Miss Marple," she said, pausing briefly by Jane's chair. "Mary's outdone herself this time." "They look delightful," Miss Marple replied with a gentle smile, though her attention was elsewhere. She noted the arrival of Miss Clara Vane, who entered the garden with a hesitant step, her pale blue dress clinging softly to her slight frame. Clara's eyes scanned the crowd, lingering briefly on Dr. Haydock, who stood near the fountain, his face set in a guarded expression. The young doctor's hands were clasped tightly behind his back, as if restraining some unspoken emotion. Nearby, Mr. and Mrs. Harrison made a striking entrance, their city's sophistication a stark contrast to the village's understated elegance. Mrs. Harrison's silk scarf fluttered as she laughed at something Colonel Bantry said, her voice carrying a practiced charm. Mr. Harrison, however, seemed less at ease, his sharp eyes darting toward the tea table where Clara stood. Miss Marple's fingers paused on her knitting needles. Was it Clara herself, or something near her, that drew his attention? Mr. Redding, the artist, had now abandoned his solitary post by the yew tree and was weaving through the crowd, his sketchbook tucked under his arm. He approached Clara, offering a smile that was both warm and tinged with urgency. "You look pale, Clara," he said, his voice low but audible to Miss Marple's keen ears. "Is everything all right?" Clara's response was a quick nod, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Perfectly, thank you, Mr. Redding," she said, her tone clipped. She turned away, busying herself with rearranging a plate of scones. Mr. Redding lingered a moment, his expression darkening, before he moved off toward the rose garden. Miss Marple's gaze shifted to Mr. Giles, the solicitor, who stood near the vicarage door, mopping his brow with a handkerchief despite the mild breeze. He was speaking to Miss Emily Thorne, the vicar's quiet cousin, whose grey dress blended almost too well with the stone wall behind her. "It's a delicate matter, Miss Thorne," Mr. Giles was saying, his voice tight with strain. "The documents, they must be handled discreetly." Emily nodded, her eyes fixed on the ground, but Miss Marple caught the faintest tightening of her jaw. The crowd grew livelier as more guests arrived. Mrs. Weatherby, ever the purveyor of village gossip, held court near the tea urn, her voice carrying snatches of speculation about the Harrisons' wealth and Mr. Redding's unseemly interest in Clara. Colonel Bantry, meanwhile, regaled a small group with tales of his hunting days, his booming laugh a counterpoint to the delicate clink of china. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind cataloguing the interactions. The Harrisons' polished reserve, Clara's unease, Mr. Redding's intensity, Mr. Giles's anxiety, and Emily's quiet watchfulness all were threads in a pattern she could not yet fully discern. But she knew from experience that such gatherings, with their forced civility, often revealed the cracks in human nature. As the sun climbed higher, casting dappled shadows across the lawn, a young maid approached the tea table with a fresh tray of scones, their warm aroma drawing appreciative murmurs. Miss Marple watched as Clara stepped back, her hand brushing against the tablecloth. A single scone tumbled to the grass, unnoticed by all but Jane, who tilted her head thoughtfully. A small thing, perhaps, but in St. Mary Mead, small things often led to larger truths. The party continued, its surface as bright as the summer day. Yet Miss Marple felt the stirrings of unease, like the first ripple on a still pond. Something was amiss, and she suspected it would not be long before the calm was shattered. Chapter 4. Tea and scones served. The vicarage garden party had settled into a rhythm of genteel chatter and clinking teacups, the summer sun bathing the lawn in a warm golden haze. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her usual unobtrusive corner beneath the spreading branches of an ancient oak, let her eyes drift over the scene with the quiet attentiveness of a painter studying a canvas. Her knitting lay idle in her lap, the needles glinting faintly as they caught the light. The air was thick with the scents of roses, freshly cut grass, and the tantalizing aroma of warm scones, which had just been brought out in abundance. The long tea table, draped in crisp white linen, was the heart of the gathering. Silver teapots gleamed alongside platters of cucumber sandwiches, delicate pastries, and the pièce de résistance, Mary's famous scones, golden and crumbly, studded with plump currants, and accompanied by dishes of clotted cream and strawberry jam. Mrs. Clement, her face flushed with the exertion of hostessing, presided over the table with a proud smile. "Do help yourselves, everyone," she called, her voice bright. "Mary's outdone herself this year." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the scones, noting the eager hands reaching for them. Mrs. Bantry, her floral hat tilting precariously as she leaned forward, took two, slathering them generously with cream. "Divine," she declared to no one in particular, her voice carrying across the lawn. Colonel Bantry, standing nearby, chuckled and accepted a scone from his wife, his mustache twitching as he took a hearty bite. Clara Vane, however, hovered near the table with a hesitancy that caught Miss Marple's eye. The young woman's fingers twitched at her sides, as if debating whether to take a scone at all. Her pale blue dress seemed to fade against the vibrant backdrop of the garden, and her eyes, large and shadowed, darted nervously toward the crowd. Miss Marple noted the way Clara's gaze lingered on Mrs. Harrison, who stood a few paces away, her sleek green dress and sparkling earrings drawing admiring glances. Mrs. Harrison, for her part, appeared oblivious to Clara's scrutiny, her laughter ringing out as she chatted with Reverend Clement about the new rose varieties. Mr. Harrison, standing stiffly beside his wife, was less convivial. His sharp features were set in a mask of polite detachment, but Miss Marple observed the way his eyes flicked toward the tea-table, lingering not on the scones but on Clara herself. It was a brief glance, almost imperceptible, but Jane's years of watching human nature had taught her to trust such fleeting moments. What was it about Clara that held his attention? A business matter, perhaps, or something more personal? Across the lawn, Mr. Redding, the artist, had rejoined the group near the fountain, his sketchbook now closed and tucked under his arm. He stood closer to Clara than was strictly necessary, his dark eyes following her every movement. "You really should try one, Clara," he said, his voice low and coaxing as he gestured toward the scones. "They're Mary's finest, and you've barely eaten all day." Clara's smile was tight, almost forced. "I'm not terribly hungry, Mr. Redding," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She reached for a scone, then hesitated, her hand hovering over the tray as if it were a chessboard and she feared a wrong move. Finally, she selected one, holding it gingerly as if it might burn her fingers. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Clara's unease was palpable, and Jane wondered if it stemmed from the company, the setting, or something else entirely. Nearby, Mr. Giles, the solicitor, was engaged in a hushed conversation with Dr. Haydock, their heads bent close together. Mr. Giles's nervous energy was more pronounced now. His thin fingers clutched a teacup so tightly that the china seemed in danger of cracking. "It's a matter of some urgency, Doctor," he was saying, his voice a strained whisper. "Will, there are discrepancies, you see," and I fear he broke off as Miss Emily Thorne approached with a tray of sandwiches, her grey dress blending into the background like a shadow. Emily's eyes were downcast, but Miss Marple caught the briefest flicker of curiosity as she passed the two men. Emily's presence, though quiet, was beginning to intrigue Miss Marple. The vicar's cousin was an enigma, her reserved demeanour masking a sharpness that Jane sensed rather than saw. When Emily offered a sandwich to Mrs. Harrison, the latter's smile faltered, and she waved the tray away with a curt, "No, thank you." Emily nodded silently and moved on, but Miss Marple noted the slight tremble in her hands as she gripped the tray. A history, perhaps, or a misunderstanding. Jane filed the observation away, her mind weaving connections like the threads of her knitting. The village clock struck 4, its chimes rolling softly over the garden. The crowd had grown merrier, the tea and scones loosening tongues and inhibitions. Mrs. Weatherby, stationed near the tea urn, was in her element, her sharp voice carrying snippets of gossip. "Of course, the Harrisons have money, but where it comes from, no one knows," she said to Mrs. Price, who nodded sagely. "And Clara Vane, such a pity about her engagement to Dr. Haydock. I heard she was seen with Mr. Redding late one evening, near the old mill." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. Gossip was often exaggerated, but it was rarely baseless. The broken engagement, Mr. Redding's attentiveness, the Harrisons' wealth, Mr. Giles's anxiety, Emily's quiet watchfulness, all were pieces of a puzzle that had yet to take shape. She sipped her tea, its warmth a contrast to the growing chill in her thoughts. The garden party was a microcosm of St. Mary Mead, its surface bright but its depths murky with unspoken tensions. As Mary, the cook, brought out another tray of scones, The crowd murmured in appreciation. Mrs. Clement clapped her hands, calling out, "Fresh from the oven, everyone. Do take another." The guests surged toward the table, their laughter mingling with the rustle of skirts and the clink of teaspoons. Clara, still holding her untouched scone, stepped back, her face pale. Mr. Redding moved closer, his hand brushing her elbow as he murmured something Miss Marple couldn't hear. Dr. Haydock, watching from a distance, stiffened, his jaw tightening. Miss Marple's knitting needles remained still, her hands folded in her lap. The scones, she thought, were more than a culinary delight. They were a focal point, drawing the guests together in a way that revealed their interactions, their hesitations, their secrets. She watched as Mrs. Harrison finally took a scone, her movements deliberate, almost theatrical. Mr. Harrison followed suit, his expression unreadable. Mr. Giles, after a moment's hesitation, selected one, his fingers fumbling as he placed it. On his plate, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the lawn. The party's cheer felt fragile now, like a glass ornament teetering on the edge of a shelf. Miss Marple's instincts, honed by years of quiet observation, told her that something was about to shatter. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes sharp behind her spectacles, as the first threads of the mystery began to pull taut. Chapter 5. The sudden collapse. The vicarage garden party hummed with the easy rhythm of a summer afternoon, the air filled with the soft clink of china and the murmur of polite conversation. Miss Jane Marple sat in her wicker chair, her knitting untouched, as she watched the guests with her usual quiet attentiveness. The tea table, laden with scones, sandwiches, and gleaming silver teapots, was the center of activity, drawing villagers like moths to a flame. Yet beneath the surface of this idyllic scene, Miss Marple sensed a tension, a thread pulled taut and ready to snap. Mrs. Clement, ever the diligent hostess, circulated among the guests, her smile bright but her eyes darting with the strain of keeping the event seamless. "Another scone, Mr. Giles?" she asked, pausing by the solicitor, who stood near the table, his plate already holding an untouched pastry. Mr. Giles, his thin face pale and his fingers twitching, shook his head. "No, thank you, Mrs. Clement," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "One is quite enough." Miss Marple's gaze flicked to Mr. Giles, noting the sheen of perspiration on his brow, despite the mild breeze. His nervous demeanor had intensified, and she wondered what discrepancies in the estate papers he had mentioned to Dr. Haydock could cause such distress. Her eyes moved to Clara Vane, who stood a few paces away, still clutching her scone, its edges crumbling slightly in her grip. Clara's face was pale, her eyes fixed on the ground, as if avoiding the crowd's gaze. Nearby, Mr. Redding, the artist, lingered close to Clara, his dark eyes watchful. He leaned toward her, his voice low. "You really ought to eat something. Clara, you're looking quite faint." Clara's response was a faint shake of her head, her lips pressed tightly together. Miss Marple noted the intensity in Mr. Redding's tone, a mix of concern and something more proprietary, which seemed to unsettle Clara further. The Harrisons, standing near the rose garden, were a study in contrast. Mrs. Harrison's laughter rang out as she chatted with Colonel Bantry, her diamond earrings catching the sunlight. Her husband, however, was quieter, his sharp gaze sweeping the crowd before settling briefly on the tea table. Miss Marple caught the flicker of his eyes toward Clara, then to the scones, and wondered what lay behind his guarded expression. Was it mere curiosity, or something deeper? Miss Emily Thorne, the vicar's cousin, moved silently through the crowd, offering a tray of sandwiches with her usual unobtrusive grace. Her grey dress blended into the background, but Miss Marple noticed the way Emily's hand steadied as she approached Mrs. Harrison, only to tremble again when Mrs. Harrison waved her away with a dismissive gesture. The exchange was fleeting, but Jane's keen instincts registered it as significant a thread to be tugged later. The village clock chimed 4:30, its notes drifting over the garden like a gentle reminder of time's passage. The guests, fortified by tea and scones, grew merrier, their voices rising in a cheerful cacophony. Mrs. Wetherby, stationed near the tea urn, continued her whispered commentary to Mrs. Price. "Mark my words," she said, her voice sharp. "There's something odd about those Harrisons, and Clara Vane far too pale for a healthy young woman. I wouldn't be surprised if she's hiding something." Miss Marple's lips twitched in a faint smile. Mrs. Wetherby's gossip was often exaggerated, but it was never without a grain of truth. She turned her attention back to the tea table, where Mary, the cook, had just set down another tray of scones, their warm aroma drawing a fresh wave of guests. Mrs. Bantry, her plate already piled high, reached for another, laughing as she did so. "I shall have to let out my dresses after today," she declared, prompting a chuckle from Colonel Bantry. It was then that the first sign of trouble emerged. Mr. Giles, who had finally taken a tentative bite of his scone, paused mid-chew, his face contorting in a sudden grimace. His teacup slipped from his hand, shattering on the grass with a sharp crack that cut through the hum of conversation. Heads turned, and a hush fell over the crowd as Mr. Giles clutched at his throat, his eyes wide with panic. "Help, please," he gasped, his voice a ragged whisper. He staggered forward, his knees buckling, and collapsed onto the lawn, his body convulsing briefly before going still. A collective gasp rose from the guests, followed by a scream from Mrs. Weatherby, who dropped her own teacup in shock. Mrs. Clement rushed forward, her face ashen. "Mr. Giles! Oh heavens, what's happened?" She knelt beside him, her hands hovering helplessly. Dr. Haydock, his medical instincts kicking in, pushed through the crowd, his expression grim. "Stand back, please," he ordered, his voice steady but urgent as he knelt to examine the fallen solicitor. Miss Marple remained in her chair, her hands folded calmly over her knitting, but her eyes were sharp as she scanned the scene. Clara Vane had frozen, her scone falling to the ground, her face drained of colour. Mr. Redding moved swiftly to her side, his arm around her shoulders as if to steady her, though his own expression was one of shock. The Harrisons stood rooted, near the rose garden, Mrs. Harrison's hand gripping her husband's arm, her earlier laughter replaced by a tight-lipped silence. Miss Emily Thorne, tray still in hand, stared at Mr. Giles's prone form, her eyes wide but unreadable. Dr. Haydock's voice broke the stunned silence. "He's not breathing," he said, his tone clipped. "I need space. Someone fetch my bag from the vicarage." A young maid scurried off, while the crowd murmured in growing alarm. Mrs. Bantry, her hand pressed to her mouth, whispered to her husband, "Good Lord, Arthur, do you think?" Poison, the word hung in the air like a dark cloud, sending a ripple of unease through the guests. Miss Marple's gaze moved from face to face, cataloguing reactions. Mrs. Weatherby's eyes were alight with a mix of horror and excitement, already spinning tales in her mind. Colonel Bantry's face was grim, his military bearing asserting itself as he tried to maintain order. Clara's trembling hands and Mr. Redding's protective stance told their own story, while the Harrisons' sudden stillness suggested something more than mere shock. Dr. Haydock worked swiftly, checking Mr. Giles's pulse and pupils, but his expression grew graver by the moment. "It's no use," he said at last, sitting back on his heels. "He's gone." A collective intake of breath followed, and Mrs. Clement let out a small sob, her hands clasped tightly together. Miss Marple's mind was already at work, sifting through the details of the afternoon, the scones, the glances, the whispered conversations. Poison, if that was indeed the cause, was a deliberate act, and the garden party, with its crowded table and distracted guests, was the perfect stage. She noted the tray of scones, still half full, and the way Clara's fallen scone lay near her feet, its crumbs scattered like clues. Who had handled the scones? Who had reason to wish Mr. Giles harm? As the crowd buzzed with shock and speculation, Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, her calm exterior belying the rapid ticking of her mind. The garden party had taken a deadly turn, and she knew that somewhere among the roses and teacups lay the truth, waiting to be unravelled. Chapter 6. The Doctor's Verdict. The Vicarage Garden. Moments ago, a scene of summary cheer now lay under a pall of stunned silence, broken only by the occasional murmur of disbelief and the rustle of skirts as guests drew closer to the grim spectacle. Mr. Giles, the solicitor, lay motionless on the grass, his face frozen in a rictus of pain, his shattered teacup a stark reminder of the suddenness of his collapse. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her wicker chair beneath the oak, observed the chaos with her characteristic calm, her pale blue eyes sharp behind her spectacles as she took in every detail. Dr. Haydock knelt beside Mr. Giles, his hands moving with practiced precision as he checked for signs of life, though his grim expression suggested he expected none. The crowd hovered at a respectful distance, their faces a mix of shock, curiosity, and fear. Mrs. Clement, her hands wringing her apron, stood frozen, her earlier warmth replaced by a look of helpless horror. "Oh, Dr. Haydock, is there nothing to be done?" she asked, her voice trembling. The doctor shook his head, rising to his feet and brushing grass from his trousers. "I'm afraid not, Mrs. Clement," he said, his tone clipped but steady. "He's been dead for several minutes. I suspect—" He hesitated, glancing at the crowd, then lowered his voice. "I suspect poison." The word, though spoken softly, cut through the air like a blade. A ripple of gasps and whispers spread through the guests. Mrs. Weatherby, clutching Mrs. Price's arm, let out a dramatic poison. I knew something was amiss. Her eyes gleamed with the thrill of scandal, though her hands shook. Colonel Bantry, standing nearby, cleared his throat and took charge, his military bearing asserting itself. Now, everyone, let's not jump to conclusions. We must send for the police at once. Mrs. Clement, may we use your telephone?" Mrs. Clement nodded numbly, gesturing toward the vicarage. "Of course, Colonel, it's in the hall." Colonel Bantry strode off, his steps purposeful, while the crowd buzzed with speculation. Miss Marple's gaze moved methodically from face to face, noting the varied reactions. Clara Vane stood rooted near the tea-table, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white, her fallen scone still lying in the grass. Mr. Redding, at her side, whispered something to her, his hand hovering near her elbow, though she seemed oblivious to his presence. The Harrisons, standing apart near the rose garden, exchanged a glance that Miss Marple found intriguing. Mrs. Harrison's face was pale, her earlier vivacity gone, while Mr. Harrison's jaw was set, his eyes fixed on the tea-table. Was it guilt, fear, or merely shock? Miss Marple couldn't yet say, but she filed the observation away. Miss Emily Thorne, the vicar's cousin, had retreated to the edge of the crowd, her tray of sandwiches abandoned on a nearby table. Her grey eyes were wide, but there was a stillness to her that contrasted with the general agitation, as if she were watching rather than reacting. Dr. Haydock, now joined by the maid who had fetched his medical bag, bent to examine Mr. Giles more closely. He sniffed cautiously at the remains of the scone still clutched in the solicitor's hand, then at the spilled tea on the grass, his brow furrowed. "There's a faint bitter odor," he murmured, almost to himself. "Possibly cyanide, though. I can't be certain without a proper analysis." He straightened, addressing the crowd. "No one is to touch the food or drink until the police arrive. We must preserve everything as it is." Mrs. Bantry, her floral hat askew, clutched her husband's arm as he returned from the vicarage. "Poison, Arthur," she whispered loudly. "In the scones, of all things, who would do such a thing?" Her voice carried, drawing nervous glances toward the tea-table, where the tray of scones sat, innocent in appearance, but now sinister in implication. Miss Marple's mind was already at work, sifting through the morning's events. The scones had been the centerpiece of the tea-table, handled by Mary, the cook, and offered freely to all. Yet Mr. Giles had been the only one to fall ill, or had he? She glanced at the other guests, noting that several still held scones or teacups. Mrs. Bantry, who had eaten 2 scones with gusto, appeared unharmed, as did Colonel Bantry. Clara, who had barely touched hers, was pale but standing. The Harrisons, too, had taken scones, yet they stood unscathed. Was the poison in Mr. Giles's scone alone, or was it a matter of timing, dosage, or something else entirely? She recalled, the moment Mr. Giles had taken his scone, his hesitation, the way his eyes had darted toward Dr. Haydock, and then to Clara. Had he suspected something? His earlier conversation about discrepancies in estate papers suggested a man under strain, perhaps aware of secrets that others wished to keep buried. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the other guests, Clara's unease, Mr. Redding's protectiveness, the Harrisons' guarded glances, Emily's quiet watchfulness. Each was a piece in a puzzle that was only beginning to take shape. The sound of a motor car crunching up the gravel drive signaled the arrival of the police. Inspector Craddock, a young but capable officer who had crossed paths with Miss Marple before, stepped out, his face serious as he surveyed the scene. Colonel Bantry met him, gesturing toward Mr. Giles's body. "A bad business, Inspector," he said gruffly. "Dr. Haydock suspects poison." Craddock nodded, his sharp eyes taking in the crowd, the tea-table, and the fallen solicitor. "Right then," he said, his voice brisk. "No one leaves until we've taken statements. Dr. Haydock, what can you tell me?" As Dr. Haydock recounted his findings, Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, her knitting untouched. The garden, so serene an hour ago, was now a stage for tragedy, its roses and teacups masking darker truths. She watched as Inspector Craddock began organizing the guests, his notebook open, his questions precise. The investigation was beginning, but Miss Marple knew that the real answers lay not in the physical evidence alone but in the tangled web of human motives and secrets. Her eyes returned to the tea table, where the scones sat untouched, their golden surfaces now a silent accusation. Someone in this garden, she thought, had planned this moment with care, and she intended to find out who. Chapter 7. Miss Marple's Quiet Observations. The vicarage garden, once a haven of summer tranquility, had transformed into a sombre tableau, its vibrant colours muted by the shadow of death. Inspector Craddock's arrival had brought a semblance of order, with constables cordoning off the tea table and ushering guests into small groups for preliminary statements. Mr. Giles's body lay covered by a white sheet borrowed from the vicarage linen closet, a stark reminder of the afternoon's tragic turn. Miss Jane Marple, still seated in her wicker chair beneath the oak tree, appeared the picture of an elderly spinster, her knitting needles clicking softly as if to steady her nerves. But her mind was far from idle. It raced with observations, piecing together the subtle inconsistencies that others might overlook. From her vantage point, Miss Marple had an unobstructed view of the proceedings. Inspector Craddock, a young man with a keen intellect whom she had encountered before, moved efficiently among the guests, his notebook in hand. He began with Mrs. Clement, who fluttered nervously as she recounted the preparation of the scones. "Mary baked them fresh this morning," she said, her voice wavering. "I helped serve them myself." "Oh, Inspector, how could this happen in my garden?" Craddock nodded sympathetically, jotting notes. "And did anyone else handle the scones? Mrs. Clement? Any of the guests, perhaps?" Mrs. Clement shook her head, but Miss Marple recalled Clara Vane's hesitant rearrangement of the plate earlier in the afternoon, a small detail, but one that might prove significant. Jane's eyes shifted to Clara, who sat on a bench near the fountain, her hands clasped in her lap, her face ashen. Mr. Redding hovered nearby, his expression a mix of concern and frustration, as a constable prevented him from approaching too closely. Miss Marple noted the artist's restless energy, his fingers twitching as if longing for his sketchbook, his gaze darting between Clara and the covered body. Earlier, he had been so attentive to Clara, urging her to eat a scone, yet he himself had not taken one. Was it mere coincidence, or something more deliberate? She remembered the way his hand had brushed Clara's elbow, a gesture that seemed protective but could mask possessiveness. In St. Mary Mead, Jane had seen such dynamics before. The jilted lover, the lingering resentment. Her gaze moved to Dr. Haydock, who stood speaking with Craddock near the tea table. The doctor's face was drawn, his usual affable demeanor replaced by a professional gravity. The symptoms were classic, he was saying, his voice low. Convulsions, rapid onset, consistent with cyanide poisoning. But how it got into the scone, that's for you to determine. Inspector Craddock frowned, examining the tray of remaining scones. "We'll have them analyzed, of course. Did Mr. Giles have any enemies that you know of?" Dr. Haydock hesitated, his eyes flicking toward Clara before answering. "He was the village solicitor, handled wills, estates. There might be disgruntled clients, but nothing overt." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused. The doctor's glance at Clara was telling. The broken engagement, the whispers of scandal, and Mr. Giles had mentioned discrepancies in estate papers. Whose estate? Clara's family, perhaps, or someone connected to the guests. The Harrisons caught her attention next. They stood apart from the main group, near the rose garden, their postures rigid. Mrs. Harrison's earlier laughter had vanished, replaced by a tight-lipped silence, her hand gripping her husband's arm. Mr. Harrison's face was impassive, but Miss Marple noted the way his eyes lingered on the tea table, then shifted to Clara with a flicker of something regret, calculation. Newcomers to the village, with their sudden wealth and polished manners, often carried baggage from the city. Jane wondered if their path had crossed Mr. Giles's in London, perhaps over legal matters. Mrs. Harrison's dismissive wave to Emily Thorne earlier now seemed laced with tension. Was there a connection there? Miss Emily Thorne herself was a study in quiet composure. The vicar's cousin had retreated to the vicarage steps, her grey dress making her almost invisible against the stone. She watched the scene with wide eyes, but Miss Marple detected no tears, no outward distress, only a watchful stillness. Emily had handled the sandwich tray, passing close to the scones multiple times. Her trembling hands when approaching Mrs. Harrison suggested familiarity, perhaps animosity. Jane recalled Emily's recent arrival in St. Mary Mead. What had brought her here, and what secrets did she harbour? As the sun dipped lower, casting elongated shadows across the lawn, Inspector Craddock approached Colonel and Mrs. Bantry, who sat on a bench, Mrs. Bantry fanning herself vigorously. "A dreadful affair," she exclaimed, her voice carrying poison. "In the scones, whoever heard of such a thing? And poor Mr. Giles, always so meticulous." Colonel Bantry nodded gruffly. "Handled my aunt's will last year. Straight arrow, I'd say." Craddock asked about their observations, and Mrs. Bantry prattled on about the guests' interactions, her gossip veering close to the mark without quite hitting it. But Miss Marple's mind wove these threads together. The poisoned scone, selected seemingly at random, but perhaps not. The glances, the hesitations, the hidden histories. Mrs. Weatherby, ever the village oracle, was whispering to Mrs. Price. Nearby, her voice a sharp undertone. "I saw Clara near the table, fiddling with the scones, and with her engagement broken. Well, who knows what desperation drives a woman?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. Gossip was a blunt tool, but it often pointed to finer truths. Craddock finally made his way toward Miss Marple, his expression polite but dismissive. "Miss Marple," he said, tipping his hat, "a shocking event. Did you notice anything unusual?" Jane's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. "Oh, Inspector, at my age, everything seems a bit unusual. But I did observe Mr. Giles's nervousness earlier. He mentioned discrepancies in some papers to Dr. Haydock, and Clara Vane seemed quite unwell before the incident, though she hadn't eaten her scone." Craddock's interest sharpened. "Unwell? In what way?" Miss Marple described Clara's pallor, her hesitation, the fallen scone. "Small things, perhaps," she added mildly, "but in village life, small things can mean so much." The inspector nodded, jotting notes, though Jane knew he underestimated her insights. No matter, she would continue her quiet observations, unraveling the knot of motives and opportunities. As the guests began to disperse under police supervision, Miss Marple gathered her knitting, her mind abuzz. The poison had been swift, but the secrets behind it were slow to surface. She glanced once more at the covered body, then at the faces of those around her. Someone here had a hand in this, and she was determined to expose it, thread by careful thread. Chapter 8. Interrogations and Alibis. The vicarage drawing-room, usually a haven of chintz armchairs and afternoon tea, had been commandeered as a makeshift interrogation chamber. Inspector Craddock, with his efficient manner and sharp eyes, had set up a small table near the bay window, where the fading light of the summer evening filtered through lace curtains. Outside, the garden lay hushed, the once festive lawn now a crime scene marked by police tape and the lingering scent of roses mixed with tragedy. Miss Jane Marple, having been allowed to remain as a witness of some standing, sat quietly in a corner armchair, her knitting needles clicking softly, providing a rhythmic counterpoint to the tense proceedings. Craddock began with the obvious suspects, those closest to the tea table or with known connections to Mr. Giles. First was Clara Vane, who entered the room pale and composed, though her hands betrayed her nerves as they twisted a handkerchief in her lap. "Miss Vane," Craddock said, his tone gentle but probing, "you were near the scones when Mr. Giles took his. Did you notice anything unusual?" Clara's eyes flickered toward the window, avoiding the inspector's gaze. "No, Inspector, I was helping Aunt Clement arrange the plates earlier, but I didn't touch the scones after they were served." Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, and Miss Marple noted the slight hesitation, as if weighing each word. Craddock pressed on. "And your relationship with Mr. Giles? He was your family's solicitor, I understand." "Yes," Clara admitted, her cheeks flushing faintly. "He handled my late father's estate. There were ... some matters still unresolved." Miss Marple's needles paused. Unresolved matters often meant disputes over inheritance, and Clara's broken engagement to Dr. Haydock had coincided with whispers of financial troubles. Craddock jotted a note. "Where were you when Mr. Giles collapsed?" Clara straightened. "By the fountain, speaking with Mr. Redding. I didn't see anything until the shout." Satisfied for the moment, Craddock dismissed her, and Mr. Redding was next. The artist entered with a defiant air, his bohemian scarf askew, his dark eyes flashing. "This is absurd," he said before sitting, his voice laced with indignation. Giles was a bore, but who would poison him at a garden party? Craddock raised an eyebrow. "That's what we're here to find out, Mr. Redding. You were seen urging Miss Vane to eat a scone. Did you take one yourself?" Reading leaned back, crossing his arms. "No, I didn't. I'm not fond of sweets. I was concerned for Clara. She's been unwell lately." Miss Marple observed the way his jaw tightened at Clara's name. "Concern, yes, but perhaps jealousy too." Craddock probed further. "And your alibi? You were with Miss Vane the whole time?" Reading nodded curtly. "Yes, from the moment the scones were served until the collapse. We were discussing ... art." The pause was telling, and Miss Marple wondered if art was a euphemism for something more personal, like rekindling an old flame. As Reading left, Dr. Haydock entered, his broad frame filling the doorway. He sat heavily, his face etched with fatigue. "A nasty business, Inspector," he said, rubbing his temples. "Cyanide. I'd stake my reputation on it. Fast-acting, odorless, in small doses." Craddock nodded. "You examined him first. Any idea how the poison was administered?" Haydock shook his head. "Likely in the Scone baked in, or added later. But I'd need lab confirmation." The inspector shifted topics. "You spoke with Mr. Giles earlier about estate discrepancies. Care to elaborate?" Haydock's expression darkened. "It was confidential, but since he's dead." Giles mentioned irregularities in a will he was handling. Something about forged signatures or contested claims. He seemed worried, asked if I knew anyone involved. Miss Marple's ears perked up. "Wills and forgeries often led to motives like greed or revenge." "And your whereabouts?" Craddock asked. "Near the rose garden, chatting with Colonel Bantry." Haydock replied firmly. "I only moved when I heard the cry." The Harrisons were interrogated together, at their insistence. Mrs. Harrison, her diamond earrings still glinting, sat with poise, though her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Mr. Harrison, beside her, was more reserved, his sharp features set in a neutral mask. "We barely knew Mr. Giles," Mrs. Harrison said, her voice steady. "We met him once in London, over a property matter." Craddock leaned forward. "What matter?" Mr. Harrison interjected smoothly. "A minor investment, nothing contentious." But Miss Marple noted the quick glance between them, a silent communication that spoke volumes. "And your alibis?" Craddock pressed. "We were together the entire time," Mrs. Harrison replied, admiring the roses, then at the tea table for scones. She paused, her eyes narrowing. "We both ate them, Inspector, and we're fine. If it was poisoned, it must have been targeted." Craddock made a note. "Targeted indeed. Did you notice anyone tampering with the tray?" Mr. Harrison shook his head. "No, but that Emily Thorne was hovering about with her sandwiches. Odd girl, keeps to herself." Miss Emily Thorne was last, entering the room like a shadow, her grey dress blending with the dimming light. She sat primly, her hands folded, her eyes downcast. "Miss Thorne," Craddock began, "you're new to St. Mary Mead. What brought you here?" Emily's voice was soft but clear. "To help my cousin, the vicar. I've been in service before, in London." Miss Marple recalled the tremor in Emily's hands near Mrs. Harrison. Service in London might connect to the Harrisons' past. "You were serving sandwiches," Craddock said. "Did you handle the scones?" Emily shook her head. "No, sir, only the sandwiches. I was near the table, but I didn't touch them." Her alibi was simple, circulating among the guests, never alone. Yet Miss Marple sensed a reserve, a holding back. "Did you know Mr. Giles?" Craddock asked. Emily hesitated. "Only by sight. He visited the vicarage once." The inspector dismissed her, but Jane's mind lingered on Emily's composure to calm. Perhaps, for a newcomer thrust into murder, as the interrogations concluded. Craddock rubbed his chin thoughtfully, glancing at Miss Marple. "Well, Miss Marple, any thoughts? You've been quiet." Jane smiled mildly. "Oh, Inspector, just an old woman's observations. Alibis are like knitting patterns. Sometimes a dropped stitch reveals the flaw." Craddock chuckled, but his eyes sharpened. "Such as..." She tilted her head. Mr. Giles's worries over estates, Clara's unease, the Harrisons' quick defenses, Emily's steadiness, and don't forget, Mary the cookers. She'd been questioned. Craddock nodded. "She claims the scones were baked fresh. No one in the kitchen but her." Miss Marple's needles clicked on. "Ah, But kitchens have back doors, and villages have gossips. Perhaps the poison wasn't in the baking, but added later, by a hand we haven't yet suspected. The inspector pondered this as the room emptied, the guests dispersing under watchful eyes. Outside, the evening deepened, stars pricking the sky above St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple gathered her knitting, her mind a whirl of alibis and motives. The interrogations had revealed Crack's jealousy in reading, financial shadows over Clara and Haydock, mysterious ties with the Harrisons, and Emily's enigmatic calm. The web was tightening, and Jane knew that one more tug might unravel it all. Chapter 9. Secrets in the Greenhouse. The following morning dawned crisp and clear over St. Mary Mead, the sun casting a gentle light on the vicarage grounds, which now bore the faint marks of yesterday's tragedies, the trampled grass near the tea table, the police tape fluttering in the breeze like a macabre ribbon. Inspector Craddock had stationed a constable to guard the scene overnight, but the village was already abuzz with speculation, whispers travelling from cottage to cottage like wildfire. Miss Jane Marple, having returned home the previous evening, with her mind full of unanswered questions, rose early, her thoughts turning to the greenhouse at the edge of the vicarage garden. It had been mentioned in passing during the interrogations, Reverend Clement's pride and joy, where he cultivated rare orchids and exotic plants, but Jane's instincts told her it might hold more than botanical wonders. After a light breakfast of tea and toast, Miss Marple donned her sturdy walking shoes and a light shawl, setting off for the vicarage under the pretense of offering condolences to Mrs. Clement. The walk through the village was revealing. She passed Mrs. Weatherby at the post office, who was regaling a small crowd with exaggerated tales of the poisoning. Cyanide in the scones. Mark my words, Mrs. Weatherby declared, her voice shrill. And Clara Vane was right there, fiddling with the tray. Oh, the scandals in that family. Miss Marple smiled politely as she passed, but her mind noted the gossip's direction, pointing fingers at Clara, perhaps to deflect from others. Arriving at the vicarage, Miss Marple found Mrs. Clement in the drawing-room, her eyes from a sleepless night. "Oh, Miss Marple, how kind of you to come," Mrs. Clement said, clasping Jane's hands. "It's been dreadful. The inspector says we can't use the garden until they've finished their tests." Jane nodded sympathetically. "Such a shock for everyone. I wondered if I might take a stroll in the greenhouse. The air is so fresh there, and it might clear my head." Mrs. Clement agreed readily, too distracted to question the request. "Of course, dear, the door's unlocked. Reverend Clement spends hours in there, but he's at the church this morning." Miss Marple made her way around the side of the vicarage, her steps measured, her eyes scanning the grounds. The greenhouse stood at the far end of the garden, a glass structure gleaming in the sunlight, its interior a lush jungle of greens and vibrant blooms. As she approached, she noticed the door slightly ajar, a detail that quickened her pulse. Had someone been here recently? Pushing the door open, Miss Marple stepped inside, the humid air enveloping her like a warm embrace, scented with earth and exotic flowers. Shelves lined the walls, laden with pots of orchids, ferns, and climbing vines. In the center stood a workbench cluttered with gardening tools, plant labels, and a stack of old notebooks, Reverend Clement's records of his horticultural experiments. Jane's gaze swept the space, her keen eyes spotting something out of place, a crumpled piece of paper half hidden beneath a pot of African violets. She bent to retrieve it, unfolding the paper carefully. It was a letter, dated 2 weeks prior, addressed to Mr. Giles from an anonymous sender. The handwriting was disguised, blocky and uneven. "You think you've buried the past, but secrets have a way of blooming. The Harrison affair isn't over. Pay what you owe, or the village will know your part in the forgery." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose. Forgery echoing Dr. Haydock's mention of discrepancies in estate papers, and the Harrisons named directly. This was no coincidence. The greenhouse had yielded a clue, perhaps discarded in haste by someone who knew its seclusion. As she pocketed the letter, intending to show it to Inspector Craddock later, Miss Marple heard footsteps outside. She turned just as the door creaked open, revealing Miss Emily Thorne, her grey dress smudged with soil, a pair of pruning shears in her hand. Emily started, her eyes widening. "Miss Marple, I didn't expect anyone here." Her voice was steady, but Jane noted the slight flush on her cheeks, the way her grip tightened on the shears. "Just admiring the orchids, my dear," Miss Marple said mildly, her tone disarming. "Reverend Clement has quite the collection. Do you help him often?" "Emily, nodded, setting the shears on the workbench. "Sometimes I enjoy the quiet. After yesterday," her voice trailed off, and she busied herself with a nearby plant, pinching off a wilted leaf. Miss Marple watched her closely. It must be difficult, being new to the village and caught up in such events. "Where did you come from, if you don't mind my asking?" Emily hesitated, her fingers pausing. "London mostly. I was in service with a family there, the Worthingtons. But things ... changed." Miss Marple's mind clicked. Worthington, hadn't there been a scandal in the papers a year ago about forged documents in a London estate? She probed gently. "Changed how? Dear, villages like ours can be a refuge from city troubles." Emily's eyes met Jane's briefly, a flicker of wariness in them. "Just family matters, nothing important." But the evasion was clear, and Miss Marple wondered if Emily's service connected to the Harrisons or Mr. Giles before she could press further. The door opened again, this time admitting Mr. Redding, his face flushed as if he'd been hurrying. "Emily, I thought I saw you come in." He stopped short at the sight of Miss Marple. "Oh, Miss Marple, I was just looking for Clara. Have you seen her?" His excuse was flimsy, and Jane noted the quick glance he exchanged with Emily, a look of shared secrets. "Not since yesterday," Miss Marple replied, "but the greenhouse seems popular this morning, perhaps for its privacy." Reading laughed awkwardly, running a hand through his tousled hair. "Privacy? No, I just enjoy the plants. Inspires my sketching." He pulled out his sketchbook, flipping to a page of rough drawings, roses, mostly, but one sketch caught Jane's eye, a quick outline of a scone, oddly detailed, with notes on shading, artistic fancy, or something more. Emily excused herself abruptly, murmuring about chores, and slipped out, leaving Miss Marple alone with reading. "You were quite attentive to Clara yesterday," Miss Marple observed, her voice soft. "Old friends, I gather." Redding's expression softened, then hardened. "More than friends, once, before Haydock came along. But that's ancient history." Jane tilted her head. "History has a way of repeating itself, doesn't it? Especially with grudges involved." Redding's eyes narrowed. "Grudges? If you're implying, look, Giles was a meddler. He advised Clara against me, said I was unreliable. But poison, that's not my style." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Of course not, dear. But people surprise us." As Reading left, somewhat brusquely, Jane lingered, examining the workbench more closely. Beneath the notebooks, she found a small vial, unlabeled, its contents a fine white powder, poison, or merely fertilizer. She left it undisturbed, making a mental note to inform Craddock. Outside, she encountered Inspector Craddock himself, striding toward the greenhouse with a purposeful air. "Miss Marple," he said, tipping his hat. "Snooping, are we?" Jane chuckled, merely observing. "Inspector, and I've found something you might like." She handed him the letter, watching his face as he read it. "Anonymous threat, mentions the Harrisons, and forgery. This ties in with what Haydock said." Craddock folded the letter carefully. "Indeed, we'll question the Harrisons again. And Emily Thornshire was in London before coming here. Might be a connection." Miss Marple nodded. "Connections everywhere, Inspector, like vines in a greenhouse, tangled, but traceable." As Craddock entered the greenhouse to search further, Jane walked back through the garden, her mind weaving the new clues. The letter's threat, Emily's evasion, Reading's intrusion, the vial. Past grudges were surfacing, rooted in forgery and old rivalries, and she sensed the mystery's tendrils reaching deeper into St. Mary Mead's soil. The day wore on, with Craddock's team analyzing the scones confirming cyanide in Mr. Giles's alone, suggesting a targeted dose added after baking. Miss Marple, back in her cottage, sipped tea and pondered. The greenhouse had revealed secrets, but more lay hidden, waiting for the right light to expose them. Chapter 10. The Midnight Confession. The clock in Miss Marple's cozy sitting room struck midnight, its chimes echoing softly through the quiet cottage. Outside, St. Mary Mead lay shrouded in darkness, the village streets empty save for the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustle of leaves in the gentle night breeze. Jane sat by the fire, her knitting in her lap, though her needles had long since stilled. The events of the day, the discovery in the greenhouse, the anonymous letter, the vial of powder had kept her mind active, turning over the puzzle pieces like a restless tide. She had shared the letter with Inspector Craddock, who had promised to investigate further, But Jane knew that some truths emerged, not from official inquiries, but from the shadows of personal turmoil. A soft knock at the door startled her from her reverie. It was late for visitors, especially in a village where folks retired early. But Miss Marple was not one to be easily alarmed. She rose, smoothing her skirt, and opened the door to find Clara Vane standing on the threshold, her face pale in the moonlight, a shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, as if warding off more than just the chill night air. "Miss Marple," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. I couldn't sleep. May I come in? There's something I must tell you." "Of course, my dear," Miss Marple replied, stepping aside with a gentle smile. "Come in and sit by the fire. You look quite done in." She led Clara to an armchair, pouring her a cup of warm milk from the kettle she had kept simmering. Clara accepted it gratefully, her hands shaking as she cupped the mug. The young woman's eyes were red-rimmed, as if she had been crying, and her usual composure had cracked, revealing the vulnerability beneath. They sat in silence for a moment, the fire crackling softly, before Clara spoke, her words tumbling out in a rush. "It's about Mr. Giles. I think I might be responsible for what happened." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly, but she said nothing, allowing Clara to continue at her own pace. Jane had learned long ago that confessions, like delicate flowers, bloomed best without prodding. Clara took a deep breath, staring into the flames. "You see, my father's estate, it's been a mess since he died 2 years ago. There were debts, more than we knew, and Mr. Giles was handling the will. He discovered something ... irregular. A forgery, he called it. Someone had altered documents to claim a larger share." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I confronted him about it yesterday, before the party. I was angry, desperate. The family home is at stake, and with my engagement to Dr. Haydock broken, well, I have nothing else." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her eyes kind but probing. "And what did Mr. Giles say, dear?" Clara's gaze shifted away. "He said he couldn't ignore it, that he had to report it, but he hinted that if I could persuade certain parties, perhaps it could be resolved quietly. I thought he meant the Harrisons. They were involved in some London investment with father. Mrs. Harrison was his secretary once, you know, before she married." Jane filed this away. It connected to Emily Thorne's London service and the anonymous letters mention of the Harrison affair. "But poison?" Miss Marple prompted gently. Clara shook her head vehemently. "No, I would never. But I did go to the kitchen earlier, when Mary was baking. I was helping Aunt Clement, and I handled the scones. If someone saw me, they might think..." Her voice broke, tears welling in her eyes. "And Mr. Redding, he's been so kind. But he knows about the forgery. He offered to help, said he could sketch fake documents or something foolish. I told him no, but what if he... Miss Marple patted Clara's hand reassuringly. There, child. Confessions at midnight often seem darker than they are. But tell me, why come to me and not the inspector?" Clara looked up, her expression earnest. "Because you're not like the police, Miss Marple. You understand people, their motives. I didn't kill Mr. Giles, but I'm afraid my secrets make me look guilty. And with Dr. Haydock, he broke off the engagement because of the financial scandal. He said it was too much, but I think there's more. He was arguing with Mr. Giles just last week." Jane's mind word. Haydock's argument, Redding's offer a forgery. The Harrisons' ties, it was a web of deceptions, and Clara's confession felt like a partial unraveling, perhaps designed to elicit sympathy or divert suspicion. Was Clara truly innocent, or was this a clever red herring, confessing to lesser sins to hide greater ones? "You must tell Inspector Craddock everything, dear," Miss Marple advised. "Holding back only tangles the threads further." Clara nodded, wiping her eyes. "I will, tomorrow. Thank you for listening." She rose, seeming somewhat relieved, and Miss Marple saw her to the door. As Clara vanished into the night, Jane returned to her chair, her knitting resuming its rhythmic click. The confession had revealed much: Clara's desperation over the estate, Redding's dubious offer, Haydock's possible grudge, and the Harrisons' deeper involvement. But it also raised questions. Why midnight? Why not confide in her aunt or the vicar? And that mention of handling the scones innocent help, or a subtle admission. Miss Marple recalled the vial in the greenhouse. If it was cyanide, who had placed it there? Emily Thorne had been in the greenhouse that morning, and her London past might link to the forgery. Reading's intrusion there too, with his sketch of a Scone artistic inspiration, or planning a substitution, and the anonymous letter, threatening exposure of the Harrison affair. Perhaps Mrs. Harrison had more to lose than wealth. If her marriage was built on deceit, the fire died down to embers, as Miss Marple pondered. Clara's midnight visit had introduced a veil of doubt, making her seem vulnerable, yet suspiciously forthcoming. In village mysteries, Jane knew, confessions were often half-truths, designed to mislead. She would watch Clara closely, and perhaps pay a visit to Dr. Haydock. In the morning, the poison had claimed one life, but the secrets it unearthed threatened to poison the entire village. As the clock chimed 1, Miss Marple set aside her knitting and retired, her mind still active. The confession was a step forward, but the path to truth was winding, with shadows lurking at every turn. Chapter 11. Shadows from the past. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's cottage, casting delicate patterns on the polished floorboards. Jane sat at her small breakfast table, a pot of tea steaming beside her, her knitting folded neatly on a nearby chair. The events of Clara Vane's midnight confession lingered in her mind, each word a thread in the ever-tightening web of the mystery. The anonymous letter, the vial in the greenhouse, the forged estate papers, and now Clara's revelations about her family's financial troubles, and the Harrisons' murky past all pointed to a deeper history, one that stretched beyond the boundaries of St. Mary Mead. Today, Jane resolved to tug at those threads, starting with a visit to Dr. Haydock, whose own shadows seemed to loom large in the affair. After breakfast, Miss Marple set out for the doctor's surgery, a modest building, near the village square. The air was cool, with a hint of autumn in the breeze, and the village was quieter than usual, as if the shock of Mr. Giles's death had muted its usual bustle. As she passed the post office, Mrs. Weatherby's voice drifted out, predictably sharp. Clara Vane was seen leaving Miss Marple's late last night. She was saying to Mrs. Price, "Up to no good, I'll wager, after that business with the scones." Jane's lips twitched. Gossip was a crude tool, but it confirmed Clara's visit had not gone unnoticed. At the surgery, Dr. Haydock greeted her with a weary smile, his broad face lined with fatigue. "Miss Marple, what a surprise," he said, ushering her into his consulting room. "I suppose you'll hear about poor Giles, a dreadful thing." Jane settled into a chair, her hands folded demurely. "Indeed, Doctor, a tragedy, and so puzzling. I couldn't help overhearing your conversation with Mr. Giles about estate discrepancies. It seemed to trouble him greatly." Haydock's expression tightened, his fingers drumming on the desk. "Yes, well, Giles was a stickler for detail. He came to me last week, agitated about a will he was handling Clara's father's, as it happens. Said he'd found evidence of tampering, signatures that didn't match. He suspected someone close to the family, perhaps even a beneficiary." Miss Marple tilted her head. "And did he name this someone?" Haydock hesitated, then shook his head. "Not directly, but he mentioned the Harrisons something about their involvement in a London deal that went sour. I advised him to go to the police, but he wanted to handle it discreetly." Jane's mind clicked. The anonymous letter had mentioned the Harrison affair and a debt unpaid. "And Clara," she prompted gently, "you were once engaged to her, I believe." Haydock's jaw clenched, a flicker of pain crossing his face. "Yes, 2 years ago. I broke it off not because of her, mind you, but the scandal around her father's estate. Forged documents surfaced after his death, and creditors came knocking. I couldn't drag my practice into it." His voice softened. "I cared for her, Miss Marple, but there were rumors about her in Reading too. Giles warned me he was trouble, said he'd seen Reading with Clara late one night, near the old mill." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Reading again, entwined with Clara's past and present. The artists offered to forge documents, mentioned in Clara's confession, now took on new weight. "And did Mr. Giles share these concerns with anyone else?" she asked. Haydock shrugged. "Possibly the Harrisons. He handled their legal affairs in London. Before they moved here, Mrs. Harrison was Clara's father's secretary, you know, before her marriage. There were whispers she profited from his dealings. This was newer, direct link between Mrs. Harrison and Clara's father." Jane recalled Mrs. Harrison's dismissive wave to Emily Thorne at the party, and Emily's own vague mention of service in London with the Worthingtons. Could Emily have worked in the same household, perhaps under Mrs. Harrison? The pieces were aligning, but the pattern remained elusive. Leaving the surgery, Miss Marple decided to visit the vicarage, hoping to catch Emily Thorne. As she approached, she saw Inspector Craddock emerging from the greenhouse, a small evidence bag in hand. "Miss Marple," he called, striding over. "Found that vial you mentioned. Traces of cyanide, confirmed by the lab. Someone hid it well, but not well enough." Jane nodded thoughtfully. "And the letter? Any progress on the handwriting?" Craddock frowned. "No matches yet, but it's clear someone wanted Giles silenced. We're re-questioning the Harrisons today." At the vicarage, Mrs. Clement was in the kitchen, overseeing Mary's scrubbing of pots, the air heavy with the scent of soap and lingering grief. Emily was absent, but Mrs. Clement directed Jane to the church, where Emily was arranging flowers. For Sunday's service, the church was cool and dim, its stained glass windows casting jewel-like patterns on the stone floor. Emily stood at the altar, her hands deftly arranging roses, her grey dress blending with the shadows. "Miss Marple," Emily said, startled but recovering quickly. "I didn't hear you come in." Jane smiled warmly. "I didn't mean to disturb you, dear. Such lovely roses. Reverend Clement must be pleased." Emily nodded, her eyes wary. "He is. I find the work soothing." Jane stepped closer, her tone conversational. "You must miss London, though. The Worthingtons, I believe you said. A prominent family." Emily's hands stilled on a rose stem. "Yes, for a time it was ... complicated." Jane pressed gently. "I imagine so, with legal matters like estates involved. Mr. Giles handled such things, didn't he? And Mrs. Harrison, I hear, was once a secretary in a similar circle." Emily's lips parted, then closed, her expression guarded. "I wouldn't. No, Miss Marple. I kept to my duties." But the slight tremor in her voice betrayed her, and Jane sensed a connection. Emily's past in London, possibly intertwined with the Harrisons and the forgery scandal. As Jane left the church, her mind wove the new threads. Haydock's broken engagement, tied to the estate scandal. Mrs. Harrison's role as Clara's father's secretary. Reading's suspicious offer to forge documents. And Emily's evasive calm. The past was casting long shadows, and Mr. Giles's discovery of the forgery had stirred them into deadly action. The anonymous letter, the cyanide vial, the poisoned Scone pointed to a motive rooted in hidden wealth or betrayal. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sipped tea and reflected. The Harrisons' sudden move to St. Mary Mead, Clara's desperation, Reading's jealousy, Haydock's regrets, and Emily's reticence formed a tapestry of motives. Someone had acted to silence Giles, but who stood to gain the most? Jane's eyes fell on her knitting, the pattern intricate but clear. The mystery was much the same. One more clue, one more conversation, and the truth might unravel. She resolved to speak with the Harrisons next, perhaps under the guise of a neighbourly call. Their polished facade hid something, and Miss Marple was determined to find out what. Chapter 12. The False Accusation. The afternoon sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, casting a golden glow on the cobblestone paths and thatched roofs. But the village's usual charm was overshadowed by the weight of Mr. Giles's murder. Gossip swirled, like autumn leaves, with every tea shop and garden gate abuzz with theories about the poisoned Scone. Miss Jane Marple, ever the quiet observer, walked toward the Harrisons' grand new home on the village's edge, her steps deliberate and her mind sharp. The anonymous letter, Clara's confession, and Dr. Haydock's revelations had painted a picture of tangled motives. But Jane knew the truth lay in the small, overlooked details she hoped to uncover in a carefully planned visit. Harrison's house, a modern affair with tall windows and manicured lawns, stood in stark contrast to the village's quaint cottages. Miss Marple knocked, her expression one of neighbourly concern, a basket of homemade biscuits in hand as a pretext. Mrs. Harrison answered, her sleek green dress replaced by a simpler frock, though her diamond earrings still gleamed. "Miss Marple," she said, her smile polite but strained. "What a surprise. Do come in." The drawing-room was elegantly furnished, with velvet cushions and a polished mahogany table, but Jane noted a faint air of anise papers hastily stacked in a corner, a glass of brandy untouched on a sideboard. Mr. Harrison joined them, his sharp features set in a guarded expression. "To what do we owe the pleasure?" he asked, his tone clipped. Jane smiled demurely. "Just a neighbourly call, Mr. Harrison, and, I confess, a touch of curiosity about poor Mr. Giles. Such a tragedy at the vicarage." Mrs. Harrison's fingers tightened around her teacup. "Dreadful, indeed. We barely knew him, though he handled some legal matters for us in London." Jane tilted her head, her voice soft. I heard you were once a secretary to Clara Vane's father, Mrs. Harrison. Legal matters must have been familiar to you. A flicker of unease crossed Mrs. Harrison's face, quickly masked. That was years ago, Miss Marple, a different life. Before Jane could press further, a commotion at the door interrupted them. Inspector Craddock entered, his face grim, accompanied by a constable and, to Jane's surprise, Clara Vane, her wrists bound by handcuffs. Clara's face was pale, her eyes wide with panic. "Miss Marple," she cried, "tell them it's not true." Craddock's expression was stern. "Miss Vane, you're under arrest for the murder of Mr. Giles. We found your fingerprints on the vial of cyanide from the greenhouse." Jane's heart sank, though her mind raced. Fingerprints. Clara had admitted to handling the scones, but the vial was another matter. "Inspector," Jane said calmly, "might I ask what led to this?" Craddock sighed, glancing at the Harrisons, who stood rigid. "Miss Vane's prints were clear on the vial, and her confession to you last night by a neighbor suggests motive. She admitted to a dispute with Giles over her father's estate and handling the scones. It's enough for now." Clara shook her head frantically. "I never touched a vial. I was in the kitchen, yes, but only to help Aunt Clement. Someone must have planted it." Her eyes darted to the Harrisons, a flash of accusation in them. Miss Marple noted Mr. Harrison's clenched jaw, Mrs. Harrison's sudden pallor. The accusation was premature, Jane thought, but Clara's desperation hinted at deeper truths. Craddock turned to the Harrisons. "You both claimed to be together at the party, but a witness, Mrs. Weatherby, saw Mrs. Harrison near the greenhouse earlier that day. Care to explain?" Mrs. Harrison's composure faltered. I was admiring the roses nearby. I never entered the greenhouse." Her husband cut in, his voice sharp. "This is outrageous. We're respectable people, Inspector. If anyone had a grudge against Giles, it was Clara, with her family's debts and that broken engagement." Jane's knitting needles, tucked in her basket, seemed to itch for use as her mind wove the threads. Clara's arrest felt too neat, too convenient. The vial's fingerprints were damning, but how had they appeared? Clara's kitchen visit was innocent by her account, yet someone could have slipped the vial into her possession, or used her presence to frame her. The Harrisons' defensiveness suggested they knew more, and Mrs. Weatherby's claim about the greenhouse warranted scrutiny. Had she seen Mrs. Harrison, or was she embellishing for effect? As Craddock escorted Clara out, Jane lingered, her eyes on the Harrisons. "A terrible mistake, I'm sure," she said mildly. "But mistakes can reveal truths, can't they? Like secrets from London-forged documents." Perhaps Mr. Harrison's face darkened, but he said nothing, ushering her out with a curt nod. Jane walked home slowly, her mind turning over the false accusation. Clara's arrest was a distraction, she suspected, meant to shift focus from the true culprit. Back at her cottage, Jane sat by the fire, her knitting resuming its rhythmic click. The anonymous letter had mentioned the Harrison affair, and a debt unpaid. Dr. Haydock had confirmed Mrs. Harrison's past as Clara's father's secretary, and Emily Thorne's London service hinted at a connection. Mr. Redding's offer to forge documents for Clara added another layer had he acted on it, perhaps leaving the vial as evidence. And Emily, with her quiet presence in the greenhouse, could she have planted the cyanide to incriminate Clara? Jane recalled a similar case in St. Mary Mead years ago, where a maid had been falsely accused of theft to protect a family's reputation. The real thief had been the master's son, desperate to cover gambling debts. Here Clara's vulnerability, debts, her broken engagement, made her an easy scapegoat. But for whom? The Harrisons, with their wealth and secrets, Reading, driven by jealousy or misguided loyalty, or Emily, whose calm demeanor masked a deeper motive. As the fire crackled, Jane resolved to visit Inspector Craddock the next day, armed with her observations. The false accusation had tightened the web, but it had also exposed new threads she would pull until the pattern emerged. The truth, she knew, was close, hidden in the shadows of St. Mary Mead's polite facades. Chapter 13. The gathering storm. The morning air in St. Mary Mead carried a chill that hinted at autumn's approach, a subtle shift that mirrored the growing tension in the village. Clara Vane's arrest for Mr. Giles's murder had sent ripples of shock through the community, with whispers of her guilt now dominating every conversation from the post office to the churchyard. Miss Jane Marple, however, sat in her cottage, her knitting needles moving with steady precision as her mind worked faster, piecing together the clues that pointed to a far more intricate truth. The false accusation against Clara, she felt certain, was a calculated move to shield the real culprit and the threads of the mystery forgery. Jealousy, hidden pasts were converging toward a dramatic climax. Jane decided to pay a visit to Inspector Craddock at the village hall, where he had set up a temporary headquarters. As she walked through the quiet streets, her eyes caught the small details. Mrs. Weatherby lingering outside the post office, her sharp gaze following Jane, a curtain twitching at the Harrisons' grand house, and Mr. Redding, sketching furiously by the village green, his expression dark. Each sighting added to her mental tapestry, reinforcing her belief that the truth lay not in the obvious but in the overlooked dot at the village hall. Craddock greeted her with a tired nod, his desk cluttered with reports and a tray of scones evidence from the vicarage, now sealed in bags. "Miss Marple," he said, rubbing his eyes, "I suppose you've come to tell me I've arrested the wrong person." His tone was half joking, but Jane's mild smile held a glint of determination. "Not wrong, Inspector, but perhaps hasty. Clara's fingerprints on the vial are troubling, but how did they get there? She denies touching it, and I'm inclined to believe her." Craddock leaned back, intrigued. "Go on." Jane folded her hands, considered the timing. Clara was in the kitchen, yes, but so were others: Mary, Mrs. Clement, and possibly Emily Thorne, who's been helping at the vicarage. The vial was found in the greenhouse, where Emily was seen, and Mr. Redding too. And the anonymous letter, mentioning the Harrison affair, it suggests a motive tied to the forged estate papers. Clara's a convenient scapegoat, but the real question is, who benefits from her arrest? Craddock frowned, flipping through his notes. The Harrisons are cagey about their London dealings, and Mrs. Weatherby swears she saw Mrs. Harrison near the greenhouse before the party. Redding's alibi with Clara is solid, but his behaviour's odd. He's been hovering around her like a guard dog. And Emily Thorne, she's too quiet for my liking. No record of trouble, but her London past is vague. Jane nodded. Vague pasts often hide sharp truths, Inspector. I'd suggest looking into Emily's service with the Worthingtons and any connection to Mrs. Harrison. Leaving the hall, Jane decided to call on Mrs. Bantry, whose gossip, though florid, often held useful nuggets. At Bantry Lodge, Mrs. Bantry welcomed her with a flourish, her floral hat replaced by a sensible cardigan. "Jane, you're a marvel for keeping calm in all this," she exclaimed, pouring tea. "Clara arrested Madgen, but I never thought her the type. Too timid, if you ask me." Jane sipped her tea, steering the conversation. "You've a keen eye, Dolly. Did you notice anything odd at the party, say, around the tea table or the greenhouse?" Mrs. Bantry's eyes lit up, eager to share. "Well, now you mention it, I did see Emily Thorne slipping toward the greenhouse, just before the scones were served. Thought she was fetching something for Mrs. Clement, but she looked furtive, and Mr. Redding, he was sketching near the fountain, but kept glancing at Clara and the table. Oh, and Mrs. Harrison, she was all smiles. But I caught her whispering to her husband when Giles took his Scone something about keeping quiet." Jane's mind clicked. Emily's greenhouse visit, Redding's watchfulness, the Harrisons' secrecy, all were threads tightening around a central knot. "And Dr. Haydock," she prompted. Mrs. Bantry shrugged. "He was with Arthur most of the time, but I saw him talking to Giles earlier, looking cross. Something about money. I think Giles handled his aunt's will, you know, and there was a row over it." Returning home, Jane pondered the mounting clues. The anonymous letter had threatened Giles over the Harrison affair and a forgery tied to Clara's father's estate. Mrs. Harrison, once his secretary, might have profited from falsified documents, perhaps with Giles's complicity or against his wishes, prompting blackmail. Emily's London service could place her in that circle, possibly as a witness or accomplice. Reading's offer to forge documents for Clara suggested desperation, but his protectiveness might hide guilt. And Haydock, with his own financial disputes and broken engagement, had reason to resent Giles. That evening, Jane attended a village meeting at the church, where Reverend Clement addressed the anxious residents. The Harrisons were absent, but Emily stood quietly at the back, arranging hymnals. Redding was there, his eyes on Clara, who had been released on bail pending further evidence, her face drawn. Dr. Haydock sat in a pew, his expression sombre. As the meeting ended, Jane approached Emily, her tone gentle. "You've been such a help to the vicar, dear. But I wondered, did you ever meet Mr. Giles in London, perhaps through Mrs. Harrison?" Emily's hands froze on a hymnal, her grey eyes meeting Jane's with a flash of alarm. "No, Miss Marple, I I kept to myself in London." But the hesitation was clear, and Jane sensed fear beneath her calm. As Emily hurried away, Jane caught Redding watching her, his sketchbook clutched tightly. A confrontation was brewing, Jane thought, as the village's secrets pressed closer to the surface. Back at her cottage, Jane sat by the fire, her knitting untouched. The storm was gathering: Clara's false accusation, the greenhouse vial, the forged estate, the Harrisons' past, Emily's reticence, Reading's sketches, Haydock's grudges. Each clue pointed to a motive rooted in betrayal or greed, but the true culprit remained hidden. Jane knew the next revelation would be pivotal, and she resolved to watch closely, ready to pull the final thread that would unravel the mystery. Chapter 14. The twist and the truth. The vicarage drawing-room was crowded, the air thick with anticipation as Inspector Craddock gathered the key players in Mr. Giles's murder. The summer light filtered weakly through the lace curtains, casting a muted glow on the faces of Clara Vane, Mr. and Mrs. Harrison, Mr. Redding, Dr. Haydock, and Miss Emily Thorne, who stood or sat in uneasy silence. Miss Jane Marple, invited at Craddock's reluctant behest, occupied her usual corner armchair, her knitting needles clicking softly, her eyes sharp behind her spectacles. The village hall had been too public for this final reckoning, and the vicarage, where the tragedy began, felt fitting for its end. Jane's mind was a whirl of clues: anonymous letter, the cyanide vial, Clara's false accusation, the forged estate papers, each thread now converging into a pattern only she could fully see. Craddock stood by the fireplace, his notebook tucked away, his expression resolute. "We're here to settle this matter," he began, his voice carrying authority. "Mr. Giles was poisoned with cyanide, administered through a scone at the garden party. The vial found in the greenhouse bore Miss Vane's fingerprints, but further evidence has come to light." He glanced at Jane, who nodded almost imperceptibly, encouraging him to proceed. Clara, pale and seated near Mrs. Clement, clutched a handkerchief, her eyes darting nervously. "I told you, Inspector, I never touched that vial," she said, her voice trembling. Craddock held up a hand. "We know, Miss Vane. The lab confirmed the vial was wiped clean before your prints were added. Likely transferred from a kitchen utensil you handled." A murmur rippled through the room, and Jane noted Mrs. Harrison's sudden rigidity, her diamond earrings glinting as she shifted. Craddock turned to the Harrisons. "Mrs. Harrison, you claimed you were near the roses, not the greenhouse. But Mrs. Weatherby's statement, a footprint matching your shoes, places you there hours before the party." Mrs. Harrison's face paled, but she laughed lightly. "A footprint? Really, Inspector? I was admiring the flowers." Her husband interjected, his tone sharp. "This is preposterous. We had no quarrel with Giles." Jane's needles paused. "No quarrel, perhaps," she said softly, her voice cutting through the tension, "but a shared history. You were Clara's father's secretary, Mrs. Harrison. During the time his estate papers were forged, Mr. Giles discovered this, didn't he? The anonymous letter threatened to expose your part in it, a deal that secured your wealth but left Clara's family in ruin." The room fell silent, all eyes on Jane. Mrs. Harrison's composure cracked, her hands twisting in her lap. "That's nonsense. I left that job years ago." But Jane continued, her tone gentle but relentless. "And Miss Emily Thorne worked in the same London household, under you, didn't she? She knew of the forgery, perhaps even witnessed it. When Mr. Giles began investigating, you both had reason to silence him." Emily, standing by the door, flinched, her grey eyes wide. I was just a maid," she stammered. Jane tilted her head. "But a maid sees much, my dear. You came to St. Mary Mead to escape that past, but Mr. Giles recognized you. You were seen in the greenhouse, where the vial was hidden, and your too calm for a newcomer caught in murder suggested you knew more than you let on." Craddock nodded, picking up the thread. "We found a second vial in your room, Miss Thorne, hidden in a sewing box. Trace amounts of cyanide, identical to the first." Emily's face crumpled, and she sank into a chair, her voice barely audible. "Didn't kill him. I only hid the vial for her." She pointed at Mrs. Harrison, whose gasp was audible. The room erupted in murmurs, and Mr. Harrison stood, his face red. "This is outrageous. Emily's lying." Jane's eyes twinkled with quiet triumph. "Not lying, I think. Mrs. Harrison, you orchestrated the forgery years ago, profiting handsomely. When Mr. Giles, as Clara's solicitor, uncovered it, He sent the anonymous letter to frighten him, but he persisted. So you turned to poison. Emily, loyal from her days in your service, helped by hiding the vial, though she didn't administer it. You slipped the cyanide into Mr. Giles's scone during the bustle of the party, knowing Clara's presence at the table would cast suspicion on her. Mrs. Harrison's eyes darted to her husband, then to the door, but Craddock's constable blocked the way. I didn't, she began, but Jane's voice cut through. You did, my dear. Your dismissive wave to Emily at the party wasn't disdain, it was fear of recognition, and your whispered words to your husband, overheard by Mrs. Bantry, were about ensuring Giles's silence. Clara's fingerprints were a clever touch, transferred from a spoon she used in the kitchen. Mr. Harrison lunged forward. You've no proof, but Craddock held up a hand. We have the letter, traced to your wife's typewriter, and a witness, Mary. The cook saw Mrs. Harrison near the scone tray when she thought no one was looking. Mrs. Harrison's shoulders slumped, her face a mask of defeat. It was for us, she whispered. Giles would have ruined everything, our name, our life. He demanded payment to stay quiet. Emily, tears streaming, spoke up. I only hid the vial because she begged me. I didn't know she'd use it. Craddock signaled the constable, who placed handcuffs on Mrs. Harrison. You're both under arrest, he said. Mrs. Harrison for murder, Miss Thorne for accessory. As they were led away, Clara sobbed, and Dr. Haydock moved to comfort her, his earlier reserve softened by relief. Mr. Redding, silent until now, looked shaken, his sketchbook forgotten. Jane leaned back, her knitting resuming its rhythm. The twist Mrs. Harrison's desperation to protect her ill-gotten wealth, using Emily's loyalty, had unraveled the mystery. Clara was cleared, and the village could heal, though gossip would linger for years. Craddock approached Jane, a wry smile on his lips. You've a knack for this, Miss Marple. I should have listened sooner. Jane smiled faintly. Oh, Inspector, it's just a matter of seeing the pattern, like knitting. The stitches always tell the truth. As the room emptied, Jane gathered her things, her mind already turning to her garden. St. Mary Mead would return to its quiet ways, but she knew its secrets would always simmer, waiting for her keen eye to uncover them. And so, the mystery of the poisoned scone is solved, with Miss Marple's sharp wit bringing justice to St. Mary Mead. The village may seem sleepy, but its secrets are as deep as any city's. What did you think of the final twist? Did you suspect Mrs. Harrison, or was Emily's role a surprise? Stay tuned for more tales of intrigue, and let the shadows of your own village inspire your next read.